Hi, hello, my name is Trina. Welcome or welcome back to my channel. It has been a few weeks since I made a video because I've been in a bit of a reading slump. I've been obsessed with a new TV show and I haven't been making any time for reading. But today I wanted to talk to you about all the books I did read in March because there were actually quite a lot of them because in the beginning of the month I was having a crazy run of reading. I had a vacation going on, so I didn't really have anything else to do and I was just reading a ridiculous number of books, and I got through quite a lot in the beginning of the month, so even though this last week has been kind of quiet for me, I still have a lot of books to talk about that I'm really excited to share for the month of March. In total, I read 16 books in March, which is great for me. That's double my monthly goal of reading 8 books, so we did great. I have a lot of nonfiction to talk about, and I'll get into the reasons for that. I have a lot of romance to talk about, and I have a couple of really big, cool books to talk about as well, so I'm excited to get into them. I'll start off by talking about the books I read early in the month that were specifically I was reading because it was snowing. You may not believe it right now, but you can see the snow up in the hills still a little bit in the background, but it was snowing so much in the beginning of March. It was gorgeous, snowy, wintry vibes. So I broke out some books that I had been saving specifically for the winter weather that I was really, really excited to read. Starting off, I finished the Winter Night trilogy by Katherine Arden. I read both The Girl in the Tower, which is the second book, and The Winter of the Witch. Starting off with The Girl in the Tower, I read The Bear and the Nightingale, the first book in the series, last winter in the snow. So I knew that these books were very wintry in vibe. I would say the second two aren't necessarily as much so as the first one is, because the first one invokes a lot of imagery of deep winter, sleeping on top of a stove for warmth and everything like that. But then these books were kind of actually maybe perfect for a March winter vibe in terms of they were winter bleeding into summer and then back into winter, which is kind of what's happening here, the changing of the seasons, all that. But essentially these books are about a young girl named Vasya, who is growing up in 1700s Russia, 1600s Russia, something like that, medieval era Russia. And her father is a wealthy landowner up in the north, and then her mother dies in childbirth with her, which sort of sets off a string of odd coincidences in her life. And she ends up inheriting a kind of magical gift from the mother's side of the family that allows her to talk to household spirits. But the spirit world and the kind of old religion of Russia is dying because Christianity is on the rise or becoming even more strict about stopping old traditions. So that's kind of the conflict of the whole series, is this conflict between the old religion, the old faith, and Christianity in Russia. And Vasya is kind of in the middle of all of that and balancing it because her brother is a monk, but she believes in the spirits, and there's all sorts of stuff like that, and it's really, really great. I liked the first book. It felt very fairy tale-esque, but it felt kind of a YA book, a very standard young adult book. I don't really know, but I loved The Girl in the Tower. Reading the second book, I can't really tell, I don't want to spoil the first book for you, so I won't go into the plot of this book specifically, but we continue with Vasya, with her siblings, with their journey, and with her and her relationship with winter as a person, the spirit of winter. And I ended up giving this book 4.5 stars. I really, really, really loved it. I can't tell you where I docked the 0.5 star from, probably just because there are certain parts I remember where Vasya was a little bit getting on my nerves, she was a little bit unrealistic, but I loved this book. It has this great feel of a folk tale of old Russia. I had just been reading a medieval history nonfiction book too, so I feel that added into this vibes of the old world and old technologies meeting magic as well, and the way that spirituality played such an important part in the lives of medieval people. I feel Katherine Arden captures that perfectly as well. The Girl in the Tower was my favorite book in the series. I just thought it was the perfect balance. I love a second book. I love a good second book. And I feel this followed up perfectly on the first book. This book is set specifically, for the most part, in Moscow and deals a lot with horses and the relationships between people in this era and their horses and how important that was. And yeah, I think Katherine Arden hits the perfect blend for historical fantasy of the real magic that was in an era before technology, then mysticism and magic and religion were like such crucial parts of life, and she just brings it to life in such a great way. So I really, really enjoyed The Girl in the Tower. And then The Winter of the Witch I also really loved. This is the conclusion of the series, book 3. This book is more focused on like a battle sequence, kind of like an epic final battle, you know? A big final conflict, chasing down the final leads, all of those things. And I still think it did really, really well at that. I gave this book 4 stars, and I loved it. It still had the same vibes of the first book. I would say, again, just some of Basilisa's decisions are a little bit like juvenile, but I love her for them at the same time. Like, she's such a great, relatable main character. She's very flawed, but also really strong and knows her own strength. And that's kind of why I like The Bear and the Nightingale so much, because you see her growing up and you see where that strength comes from a little bit more. But following up on her story, I just think the ending is so good. And like, the shock I got, or like not the shock, but the excitement I had when I finished the book and read the author's note, and she was like, yes, this final battle is based on a real historical battle. And I'm like, I love when historical fantasy authors do stuff like that. I thought it was so cool, and really a fun contrast to a book I'll talk about later in this video, The Brothers Karamazov, which talks about Russia in the 1800s. So the idea of like, we're talking about here, a balance being struck between Christianity and the old religion, and that kind of like in their culture, and like trying to find ways to preserve their cultural historical practices while having a new religion that in many ways is against those practices. And then reading The Brothers Karamazov, where they're debating religion the whole time. So I just thought it was like the perfect lead-in for that. I thought it was great timing, very wintry, really nice. And I love this series. I think it's underrated to me. Like, it's not underrated to other people, but I think when I think about my favorite series, I don't necessarily think about these books, but they're really high up there. Like, I really think they're such a cohesive, well-done narrative from beginning to end, and very fairy tale vibes, very storytelling. Love these. And then the other winter book I read early in the month is actually a Swedish book. One of my reading goals for the year is to read a certain number of books in my other languages that I speak other than English. So when we were cleaning out storage last month, I found this children's book. I found a lot of children's books that my grandparents had given me when we were young, and I thought, oh, I have seen this book talked about. I think it was, who was it? It might have been Emma who recommended this book, the English translation of it, that is, but I thought it gave up the perfect vibes, and I really want to read more Tove Jansson, who is an amazing Finnish author who wrote in Swedish, and I have so many of her books on my want to read, and since I had this one, and the cover is so cute, and it's a wintry book, and it was winter outside, let's read it. I loved this so much. This is one of the Moomin books, which is kind of like a fantastical version of a family who is living in like the far north. So they have very long winters, but they sleep through the winter generally. Normally they fall asleep before the first snow even falls, and then they wake up and it's springtime. They hibernate throughout the whole winter. But in this book, the little Moomintrollet wakes up in the middle of winter, probably around midwinter, like around New Year's, when it's the darkest outside. The sun doesn't even rise at this point, and he can't seem to fall back asleep. So he's the only one in his family awake, and he doesn't know what to do because he doesn't have his mom to take care of him. And he goes out wandering in the snow and meets new friends and new adventures, and learns to appreciate the beauty of the struggle of surviving in winter. I think that's what's so beautiful about this book, is like there's all this language about like how hard it can be to live in winter, and how hard you have to work in comparison to have joyous experiences, which Moomintrollet really, really resents in the beginning, because he wants to like have an easy summer. He wants to go swimming again. He misses his family. He misses how normal that was. But this is a new season of life for him, a new chapter in his life, and it's beautiful the way that Tove Jansson writes about winter as like this place so full of possibility, but it's incredibly dark and scary and cold, and she doesn't like shy away from those things. Like, it is freezing, you can die, these characters can like get put in danger if you're not careful, you don't take care of yourself and your family as well. If you don't take care of the people around you, then winter can be so fatal. But if you do those things, if you take care of each other, then it can also be incredibly beautiful. So yeah, I give this book 5 stars, obviously. If you can read Swedish, obviously read this book, but also really recommend the English translation. I've heard amazing things about all of Tove Jansson's books. I might be picking up one of her summer books for in the summer, just because I enjoyed this so much. It's just a little 120-page book that goes so perfectly with the winter vibes. I know it's a little late to recommend it for a lot of people, but for next winter, or now that we're entering into spring and summer, read her summer books, because she just has such a way with understanding seasons and time passing and everything like that that I absolutely adored. So yeah. Okay, so next up I have quite a few nonfiction books to talk about. This is kind of out of character for me because I do sometimes throw in a nonfiction audiobook into my rotation, but generally I get enough of the news from the news, so I try to like use reading as escapism. But I've really found recently that escapism just hasn't been working for me, like with everything going on in the world. Not to remind people, if they're here for escapism, sorry too, I'll get this over with fast, but like everything that's happening in the world right now is really devastating for so many people, and it's so scary to watch, and it's very worrying, and you can feel very powerless. And I feel like for me, escapism hasn't been working in the way that it has in the past when things have been tough in the world, because I want to understand. Like, I want to know why this is happening, what is going on. Like, I want to understand people better. I'm like searching for nonfiction books to help remind me as well that there are people out there doing the good work. You know what I mean? Like, I'm reading nonfiction to remind myself that there are scholars and academics and so many people out there that care about things. Because right now it feels like online, all you ever see is the people who don't care and are just being cruel for the sake of being cruel. Almost all of these books were 4- and 5-star books to me, and they all reminded me that there are people out there who are doing the work and the research and the time and the energy into progressing human knowledge and intellectualism, and that there are people out there still striving for those things. So yeah, that's what I was searching for in these nonfiction books, and I really, really found them. So I wanted to go through them and explain what they are about, because I would recommend all of these to different people. Starting off was the one that I didn't listen to on audiobook, that I actually read on my phone, oddly enough. And I say oddly enough because I normally don't read nonfiction, because it's very like, oh, it reminds me of school. It has that little like Pavlovian bell for reminding me of being back in college and studying, and it feels like work as opposed to relaxation. But this book, I really didn't feel that way. I was kind of just like reading it on my phone here and there, read a chapter about this, chapter about that. And that is How to Hide an Empire by Daniel Immerwahr. I really, really enjoyed this. This is a nonfiction book about the history of the US empire, which a lot of people don't acknowledge. Like, I feel like we hear a lot about the British Empire, even like the Dutch or the French colonies, but we don't hear a lot about what the US was doing during these times of imperialism. A lot of that is because a lot of the places that were colonized in those times became part of the United States, and now we just think of them as states. Like, when we think of Alaska and Hawaii, we just think of them as US states, as opposed to understanding like the deep empirical roots that were in those countries leading to before their joining the US. And also, when we think about the US a lot, we often think about the mainland or the 50 states, and we don't think about the countries that we have specific empirical power over still, like Puerto Rico, like Cuba, which has gotten a lot more news press recently when talking about like Guantanamo Bay and the right of the US to just like ship people out of the country wherever they want. This book sort of explains the history of that if you're interested, talking a lot about the Philippines and a lot about the assortment of Pacific Ocean islands that the US claimed and why they claimed them, and a lot about how World War II changed empire globally. That was the part I found most interesting about this book. If you can't tell, I loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. I think I gave it a 0.5 decrease just because some parts felt a little like weirdly organized. Like, I felt like the pacing was a little bit off, but I still really recommended it. It's just, as always, the difference for me between a 4-star and a 5-star is just like my mental state while reading it. Like, realistically, if I read a lot of 4 stars that I rate 4 stars, if I had read them on like a different day, they might have been a 5-star. So, but I gave this book 4.5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it. My favorite part, or the parts that I found most interesting, was talking about how World War II specifically changed the way we think about empire, and that these countries, in a lot of ways, we think about decolonial efforts as like, oh, these countries withdrew and the lands that were left behind got to reclaim their independence. But in reality, this book sort of goes into why they withdrew, because it was actually more economically profitable for countries to withdraw and leave the colonies to their own economic crises while they continue to extract resources and businesses and money that they've been setting up during the colonial period. So I just thought that part was so interesting. So much stuff that I guess I knew, but I also didn't know. And like, specifically about the US, if you want to know more about US history, or you think that like the modern era is unprecedented, it's not. It's really not. And I really think everything in this book should be taught in schools. Like, I had a really great high school education and we still didn't talk about so many of the things brought up in this book and the very real consequences that they have on like our current country and the shape of the current United States. So if you're from the US, I would really, really highly recommend this book because we weren't taught a lot of it and it involves our own history. So pick it up. Going into the audiobook nonfictions I read, I got through so many audiobooks this month. The first one was actually one that I was just finishing up, that I spent pretty much the entire month of February reading, and then I finished it in the beginning of March. And that is A Distant Mirror, The Calamitous 14th Century by Barbara Tuchmann. This may seem like a slightly random book to be listening to. I think I've mentioned this on one of my other reading vlogs, but when I read the short story collection by Naomi Novik, Very Deep and Other Stories, she had one story that was set in like the 14th century. And in her like introduction to that short story, she mentioned that she had been reading this history book. And at the time I was like, I want a history book to read. I wanted a good long audiobook. So I picked up this like 30-hour history tome about medieval era France, which specifically follows the 14th century, like all the major events of the 14th century, this like kind of turning point into the Renaissance and like kind of a turning point from the Dark Ages, you know? And also when the plague became the Black Death, the plague, was at its peak. And Barbara Tuchmann follows all of this through the lens, for the most part, of one guy who really reads like a George R. R. Martin character. He was very bold and daring and had like a big personality. I actually really enjoyed this. I'm sure a lot of people, that are already into history, have heard of this book, and people that aren't into history don't want to read this book, and that's so fair, so I'll keep it short and sweet. But I really enjoyed the experience of reading this book. I gave it 4 stars. I would say the last 10 hours of the audiobook dragged a little bit for me. There comes a point where in the beginning of the book you're introduced to a set of kings and their sons and like the leaders in both England and France, and you knew those names and then you could follow them and you could sort of vaguely follow their children as well. That made sense to you. But by the time we get to the end of the book and we're talking about their grandchildren / cousins / the warring families in Italy, I got a little confused, not gonna lie. But I still really enjoyed it. I just think the beginning part is definitely my favorite in this book, and I think the part that made the biggest impression on me was you can see how this book specifically, I'm imagining this book specifically, but maybe also other books in this genre, like medieval history texts, influence the current fantasy genre so much, which is like crazy to think about, I guess, because we know that these are medieval fantasy books, but like some of these people in the medieval ages act like actual Monty Python characters. Like it feels like a skit, like these can't be real. But Barbara Tuchmann does such a good job in talking about how the likelihood of people dying being such a regular part of the 13th century actually made people very callous. Like it made people not care about all they cared about was life after death, and all you had to do to ensure a good life after death was to pay off the church before you died. So people could be unfathomably cruel and careless, and it didn't matter during their lives for the most part, which I thought was really an interesting perspective, and I hadn't considered that. I think more fantasy authors should take that into consideration. I thought that was really cool. But there's literally like a part where she talks about like fire and blood, and I'm like, George R. R. Martin was here. Like, I know he read these words. I know he read this before writing Game of Thrones. Obviously, this book came out, I think this book came out after, like, Tolkien, who's the real founder of, like, but if we talk about the influence that George R. R. Martin, specifically as an author, has had on the last, like, 20 to 30 years of high fantasy publishing, I think a lot of it can also be traced back to 70s and 80s history texts like this one. So if you're, like, a mega fantasy nerd and you want to like know what the inspiration for the inspiration was, then I actually recommend this book because I thought it was pretty cool. It did take me like a month to listen to, which maybe added to my confusion and not fully always following what was going on, but I really enjoyed it. The next nonfiction audiobook I listened to was The Right to Sex, Feminism in the 21st Century by Amia Srinivasan. This is a collection of essays about feminism, gender, sex, the usual culprits for my essays that I read. And I really, really enjoyed this collection. It took me right back to the readings I did in college, but like in a really great way. Like I'm like, wow, I missed engaging with feminism on this level. I missed acknowledging that feminist scholars are doing this work at this level when so much of what you see online these days is just misery. So I really, really liked all of the essays. I think some of them less so, which is why I ended up giving this collection 4 stars overall, because when you have a collection like of not unrelated but like separate essays, then I have different feelings about all of them as individuals. So I think 4 stars is like a solid middle ground, where there were some 5-star essays in this for me and there were some 3-star essays. My favorite essays were The Right to Sex, the titular essay, which then also had like a follow-up essay where she addresses criticisms of the original essay. So I thought that was really interesting, like her in dialogue with herself and her critics. I thought that was really cool. And The Right to Sex is specifically about a shooting on a college campus by an incel and talking about that the right to sex doesn't exist. That's why the right to sex is kind of like a misnomer in that case. Other essays I gave 5 stars was On Not Sleeping with Your Students, which offered just a really interesting insight that I don't think I ever see talked about very much, about like the obligation of arbiters of knowledge to not confuse their own ego and like create relationships between their students that shouldn't be there. I thought it was really cool. And then Sex, Carceralism, and Capitalism, that deals a lot with prison abolition in a feminism-focused lens, which I thought was super relevant and super interesting. So if you don't want to read the whole collection, and you should, it was only like a 7-8 hour audiobook, so it went by really fast. I highly recommend, because each of the essays can kind of be listened to individually, but my favorites were definitely those 3. So yeah, overall, really enjoyed it though. And then the next audiobook I listened to was kind of a random one, Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World by Naomi Klein. I started this audiobook back in January and I couldn't get into it because the first couple of chapters were just talking a lot about American politics on a layer that in January I was not prepared to listen to. That's why I immediately went and listened to a medieval history textbook instead. But I was just not in the mood for that at the time. But I came back to it this month because no one else had checked it out from the library, so I checked it out again. And I was like, let me give this another shot. And somewhere around the 25-30% mark, I fell into this book. I think it's so unbelievably good. Doppelganger is basically a nonfiction text mostly focused on the present day, but addressing the rise of conspiracy theorists and all of these like really harmful counter movements that we've seen kind of like become incredibly popular in both recent years, but also just like the slow buildup of that. And I don't even know how to describe it. Naomi Klein like breaks down both how those come to be and how they're all interrelated and interconnected through the lens of talking about another Naomi who is a right-wing conspiracy theorist now, and how both that like case of mistaken identity in a couple of cases sent Naomi Klein down a rabbit hole of uncovering what is happening on this side of politics and how important it is to follow what the right-wing conspiracy theorists are saying in order to understand how they're becoming so well known and recognized and how to counter their language. And I thought it would make me really depressed to read this book because general state of the United States, but I actually found it comforting in a weird way. Like I liked hearing that Naomi Klein thinks there's something we can do about these things and that she's offering solutions and that she's talking about these people that feel so sometimes nonsensical or like incomprehensible in a very comprehensible way. Like she comprehends what is going on, and that's like comforting when so much of the rhetoric you see online is like these people are saying absolute nonsense. It's like, well, to them, it's not nonsense. And how do we understand how it comes to be, and how to show where fact becomes fiction in this mirror world, in this secondary world that Klein is uncovering and discussing. And I'm explaining this so poorly, but I gave this book 5 stars, which is kind of random, but it really just impacted me. And I came out of this book just like ready to read like 10 more nonfiction audiobooks, which is always the sign of a good nonfiction, when it makes you want to like keep exploring a subject. And I thought, like, writing wise, it was incredibly well written. She drew clear parallels in the beginning. She had her own arc in the story for herself and her family, while going into specific subjects in very great detail, as like, did it take you out of that story and then bring you back into them? I just thought it was masterfully written. Like, she's an incredible writer, and that is what made it so good. Like, even though it's a nonfiction book about our real world, it felt very persuasive, and I was very intrigued, and it's just important work she was doing. So I really like this nonfiction, and I highly recommend it. I swear we're halfway done with the nonfictions. We're almost there. The next one is, I read a book that I've had it on hold for a long time. I don't remember, I think maybe it was recommended by the book Leo. I don't remember where I saw it recommended, but that is Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. This is technically like a sex self-help manual about like how to improve your sex life, but also like how to understand how sexual functions in the body work. But it reads very self-helpy because she has like guides and TLDRs, and she wants to make it very accessible to the reader. So in general, I ended up giving this 3.5 stars, which is not like it was the lowest rated nonfiction I read this month, but not like in a bad way, just that like it wasn't for me. Like I didn't need to know this information right now. I went into this book really interested in like the science kind of behind sexual functions, and like how the brain synapses actually work in that way, and how biologically certain things can work. And of course, I'm always interested in like uncovering the gender essentialism of it all, and like going into stuff like that I just feel like this book was not for. This book was for a specific type of person that wanted to feel, that wanted a self-help guide on this subject. So the language was very accessible, and it was written to be like very understandable in like layman's terms, which I think was really important. And maybe I'll come back to it at some point in the future if I feel like I'm struggling in the areas that this book addresses. But it just wasn't for me at the moment, which was kind of disappointing. But I don't think it was bad, it just wasn't necessarily like my cup of tea. But the next book absolutely was. The next book, nonfiction book I listened to this month was Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. I have owned a physical copy of this book for like 6 or 7 years, since high school. It is a sort of memoir-esque nonfiction retelling of Bryan Stevenson becoming a lawyer that deals primarily with people who are on death row specifically, and then how he branched into people that are on death row as children and then therefore live on death row, and then people who are given life sentences as children, which is like not death row, but still at the same time like life sentences without parole, and how he breaches like each of those areas in his work. And so it's kind of memoir-esque. I'm explaining this badly, but the story also does this thing where it goes back and forth each chapter with talking about those subjects, while then going back to the story of one specific man, Walter Macmillan, who Bryan Stevenson worked with as a lawyer, who was very obviously falsely accused of the crime for race-based reasons in Alabama in the 1980s, and was put on death row before he even had a trial, and then was on death row for 6 years for a crime that is so obviously didn't commit because of incredible like police corruption that was uncovered. And it's just such a powerful book. It's so powerful. I have this whole backstory with this book where it was offered as one of our reading options in high school, and too many people wanted to read it, so I was like volunteered to read one of the other books instead. And I ended up reading Hillbilly Elegy. I ended up having to read Hillbilly Elegy in school instead of Just Mercy, and just like, oh, the difference. If I had read Just Mercy earlier, maybe I would have ended up going to law school like I kind of originally thought. But I really think this book is incredible. 5 stars, obviously. It's not like the craziest, most beautiful writing on earth, but that's not what the point of the book is. The point of the book is to shed light on subjects and on people and share the stories of real people who are going through real horrendous things, but understand how you can still fight for those people, how we can still fight to make a more just world in the future, and that thousands of years of human cruelty doesn't have to be the future for the world, that we can fight to make a country that believes in a type of just mercy, in a mercy for people both who haven't committed crimes, but also people who have committed real crimes, but at the same time seeing them as human beings and offering them a type of mercy is a part of what makes us human. It was just a really, really important book that was really hard to read at certain points. Like, I picked up the audiobook, and then whenever I tried to sit down with a physical book that weekend, I couldn't pick up a physical book. I was like, no, I need to get back to Just Mercy. I'm still thinking about that. So it just makes you feel a lot of things. But it was really, really impactful to me, and I think everyone should read this book. It's, like I said, it's written in a very accessible way. It's not super difficult to read. A lot of people I know read it back when I was in sophomore high school English, so it's totally accessible, and I think it is really critical for understanding where people are coming from in discussions about prison these days, because recently rhetoric around punishment, it's becoming more accepted, I would say, in general rhetoric, versus when this book was published in 2014, we were moving towards a kinder outlook on the world that now we're moving away from again. So I just I think it's important to keep this book alive and keep reading it and passing it around and bringing back that kindness in the human soul. I don't know how I'm describing this. You should read Just Mercy if you haven't. I'm sure you have, because I'm always behind on the times. And then we're at the end of the nonfictions. The very last nonfiction I read in March was kind of a random pickup for me. I read Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green, which is his new book that was released in March, because I was starting a 6-hour drive. So I was looking for a short nonfiction audiobook that I could finish on the drive. And lo and behold, on Spotify Premium, John Green's new book is available on Spotify Premium, and I have Spotify Premium, and I'm like, let's just give it a listen. Let's see what this is about. And I really, really enjoyed this book, and I thought it was really interesting. I don't know what I was expecting. I think when I saw the title, Everything is Tuberculosis, I guess I was kind of figuring oh, it's going to be some sort of metaphor of tuberculosis for another issue. But this book is very much about actual tuberculosis, which is still such a global health crisis, and talking about the current present day global health crisis of tuberculosis, as well as going back and forth with the historical context of tuberculosis as a human illness throughout the centuries, which used to be called consumption and is now tuberculosis, and both scientifically how the disease works and how the cure for it works. And then in the reality, the heart of the book is about a young boy named Henry who lives in Sierra Leone, and using his story to shed light on the reason why this very curable illness is still killing so many people, because of the greed of the pharmaceutical industry that won't provide these drugs at prices affordable for these countries that are really financially struggling. And how also that's kind of a cyclical problem, that if so many people are sick and dying and they can't go to school and they can't work and they can't educate themselves, and how important education is, then the country's not going to get richer, and they're not going to be able to afford more medication. So it's about how these health crises are also self-perpetuating in so many ways. I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was really cool. It's very, very short. I think it was only a 5 or 6 hour audiobook. So I give it 4 stars. I really liked it. It was pretty short. It wasn't the craziest writing on earth, and it was fairly short. Also, if you're looking for the vibes of did you watch Crash Course videos when you were in high school? I remember my teachers used to put John Green and Hank Green's Crash Course history and science videos on during class. We used to watch those. And this book, because it's narrated by John Green, feels like listening to one of those videos for 5 or 6 hours. So I thought it was really cool. I don't know how many more ways I can say that something is really interesting, fascinating. I'm in the mood to be fascinated. Can you tell? I read 7 nonfiction books this month, and I was just in the mood to learn something and be fascinated of the world again and be excited by the world again. And I feel these nonfiction books 100% did that. And I enjoyed all of them so much, and recommend the audiobooks for all of them so much. Yeah, I just checked my phone, and that nonfiction segment was 32 minutes long. Okay, but I'm gonna try to go through the rest of it relatively quickly, because that was the bulk of the books I read this month. My next category of books that I wanted to talk about is I read some romances this month. to break up the nonfiction and to break up some of like the heavier fantasy texts I was reading. I just wanted something light, something fluffy. I started out by reading a duology of romance novels by K.J. Charles. The first one was The Secret Lives of Country Gentlemen. I liked this. It's a historical romance set on like the coast of England in like a real historical place that I thought had a great setting of like the moors and like the swamp vibes and talking about the animals out there, and I loved those vibes so much. And I liked the romance in here. It was cute. It was about two men that had been seeing each other in secret, because it's historically accurate. So they were seeing each other in secret in the city, and then they kind of break up because one of them, his father unexpectedly dies, and then he goes to inherit his father's estate, which happens to be in the same area as the other guy is operating a smuggling business. And then they run into each other and things happen. And they fall back in love, and then they figure out how to make it work. And like a lot of really dramatic stuff happens, like kidnappings and court cases and overcoming the law, and in just in ways that I wasn't expecting. Like there's a lot more plot to this. I really liked it. I gave it 3.5 stars. I think I largely docked it down just because like the writing wasn't particularly crazy, and there were a couple of historical inaccuracies that like I can't always get over. You know, sometimes I can if I'm like really attached to the characters, but in this case I was just sort of like, yeah, I like these characters, they're nice. So I couldn't quite get past like one of them called someone else, oh, is this your boyfriend? Like as an insult. And I'm like, we're in the early 1800s, and I Googled it, and I'm like, yeah, the word boyfriend wasn't colloquially used until the 1900s. Like, I just like, it felt like such a modern day, present day insult that I was like taken out of the story. So that's like a pet peeve of mine in historical fiction. But in general, I liked the romance. I thought it was good. And then I read the second book, which was A Nobleman's Guide to Seducing a Scoundrel, which I liked a little bit less. For one specific reason. In the first book, there was like a lost treasure, and this young boy was involved in the lost treasure and everything like that. And then in the second book, 15 years have passed, and that older boy is now obsessed with this treasure and like finding it. And that leads him to the house of like I forget what their titles are, Earl, Duke, whatever, where he sort of fakes a letter pretending that he could actually be in line for this house. Like he should actually be the one who's like the Earl, whatever the title is, in order to get into the house to look for the treasure. That's the plot of the book. And then obviously the actual Earl and him fall in love. My problem is, I know this is historical fiction, okay? I know this is historical romance. I know we're set in the 1800s. Are they not related? If you don't want any spoilers for this book, skip, but like, who cares about spoilers for romance books? If at the end of the book they reveal that he actually is probably legitimately the heir to this house, which he then decides to keep secret from his new love, by the way, which is a choice, it would mean they were related. Like, first cousins. Or am I misunderstanding this? Like, I was trying to look through the reviews, and I think I might have totally misunderstood that. But it doesn't actually matter, because even if I totally misunderstood that plot line, like that wasn't even what was happening, it completely took me out of this book. I give it 2.5 stars because it wasn't like horrendous. I read the whole thing. I enjoyed it. I read it in like a day, but I wouldn't recommend it. I wouldn't recommend it per se, because I was so fixated for like the first 50% of the book of being like, so are the main two love interests related? Which I just don't think is a conflict you ever want to set up for a romance book. Like, I just don't think you ever want to do that. And I pretty much only finished it because I was kind of attached to the character. Like, we'd followed him in the first book as well, and at this point, like, we'd built up a rapport with him. I was interested, I was intrigued, but yeah, can someone explain to me, if you've read these books, like, maybe draw up a little family tree for me about how they're not actually first cousins? That would be great, because I still don't know how that's supposed to work. But moving on, the next romance book I read was a new release that I was really excited for. I read Go Luck Yourself by Sarah Rosh, which is the follow-up sequel in the same universe as The Nightmare Before Christmas, which I really liked. I gave that, I think, 4 stars probably. Like, I thought it was really, or maybe like 3.5 stars. I don't know. I thought it was really great vibes for a romance, and I loved The Nightmare Before Christmas. I read it last fall. And this book, Go Luck Yourself, was released around St. Patrick's Day, obviously, because I don't even know if I can go break down the whole world for you right now, but it's set in a world in which each holiday has its own like ruling family that controls and runs the holiday. They basically get joy from their holidays, and then they store that up and can use that joy as like, that's like their source of money or fuel or whatever. I don't know. The plot is kind of ridiculous, but I really enjoyed the characters. Like, the characters felt very real and grounded in the first book, and funny and relatable, and I loved them. So I was really excited to read the second book, which was about the brother from the first book falling in love with like the prince heir of St. Patrick, the holiday, St. Patrick's Day. But I actually ended up kind of despising this book, and it's really unfortunate. And that's not a popular opinion. I think a lot of people who like the first book also like the second book, and you might be one of those people. Let me tell you why I wasn't. I gave this book 2 stars. And honestly, I could explain so many things that I didn't like. I didn't like that the characters felt more like one-dimensional than they did in the first book. They felt too perfect. The plot line didn't make as much sense in the first book. The plot line in the first book was kind of fun because they're trying to bring communism to Christmas, which I thought was hilarious and just like a good time. This one was less intriguing. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, old dude trying to steal power. We need to steal power back, blah, blah. And I found the side characters less compelling overall, although I do still want a 3rd book with Iris and that sister, because like, come on, give Iris her lesbian love story. Like, that's what she deserves. But all of those things, all of my critiques don't really matter because it could have still been like a good time, a silly, goofy good time. The real problem is that the fake, like, written out accent, Irish accent for both the main character and also his sisters, but mostly the main character, was so unbearable. It was kind of like how Hagrid's accent in Harry Potter is written out, except even like less researched. She picked out like 2 or 3 little like things to put in their in their language to be like, oh, see, they have an Irish accent, remember? But it just got so repetitive because she just used the same like 3 things over and over and over again. And specifically, the main love interest guy that I've already forgotten the name of, calling everyone boyo, drove me absolutely insane. Like, he said it every single damn page. I was like, there are no other Irish slang words. Like, there was not a single other Irish slang word in the Google search Sarah Rash did for this book that she could have included other than just saying boyo constantly. Like, there was a sex scene in this book, and if the guy I had sex with then called me boyo 5 seconds ever, I would be out of there in a heartbeat. I cannot believe she wrote that. It enraged me. I was like, no, absolutely not. And I don't not recommend it because it's a pet peeve problem, but boy was I pet peeved. I know she has another book coming out this fall in like a different world, and I wouldn't be opposed to reading that, as long as none of the characters have accents. Yeah, we'll leave it there. The last romance book I read was kind of a fantasy romance. I read Rebel Witch by Kristen Ciccarelli, which is the sequel to Heartless Hunter, which came out last year. I got it from Book of the Month last year, read it last year, enjoyed it. I think I gave it like 3 stars. It was okay. This world is basically about witches that need to cut themselves and use their own blood or the blood of others in order to perform magic. And the first book is post a uprising by the humans on their like island country, where they've now taken down the witches, and now they're hunting down the witches and killing them off one by one. And the main character is trying to save the witches and put them on ships, sending them to other countries to keep them safe. Like, get them out of the country because they would be killed if they were discovered. And then she falls in love with the main witch hunter guy, who doesn't know who she is and she doesn't know who he is, but they both kind of like fall in love anyways. Very enemies to lovers. I thought the first book was cool, and I was looking forward to reading the second book because I wanted that resolution. I don't know. It just wasn't as good as the first book. It wasn't as good. So I ended up giving Rebel Witch 2.5 stars. I don't think it was like the worst thing ever. It wasn't They weren't related, at least, you know, so at least they had that going for them. It just was really hard to get through this book. It felt both longer, like part of the reason why I enjoyed the first book is because it was very light and easy to fly through. I just sat down and read it in like one sitting, versus Rebel Witch, I actually like couldn't pick up for several days, and I ended up only finishing it because I switched to the audiobook for the last bit. Side note, the audiobook narrator, amazing. The audiobook narrator is she has the coolest accent, and she does the greatest little accents for everyone, other than like her Cockney accent is a little bit obnoxious, but otherwise I really love the narrator. But that was the only reason why I could finish it, because otherwise it just dragged a lot. I think the first book also had a setting going for it. It was in one place. It was very cohesive narratively. This book, we were all over the place. We were taking a ship there, and then taking a ship back, and then taking a ship back again. It just dragged on. It just felt very, very dense for romantasy. I was kind of rooting for the main characters. I actually kind of liked how that romance was set up in terms of an enemies to lovers. They have a real reason to be enemies. They both have their own reasons for fighting. He has his experience with really evil witches, and he has a lot of trauma around what those witches have done to him. She has experiences with really cruel humans, and she knows what humans are capable of, so they have like real reasons to be enemies that they can like overcome. But in the end, that part also felt like it was only a problem until it wasn't. Like, they were like bickering and arguing for the first 50% of Rebel Witch, and then all of a sudden the guy character, Gideon Sharp, just decided to be like, actually, you know what? We're more alike than we are different. We should all work together. And I'm like, agree, but where did that come from? Because it really didn't feel like you were in that direction at all. I would say I'm glad I finished the series. I wanted that plot resolution. I wanted to know how the story from the first book ended, and I'm glad it was only a duology, thank God. I feel like the rush these publishers put on these authors, where I think like they're like, you have to get the second book out within a year. Like, you have to get the book out next year. I'm just like, but they could write a much better book if you gave them time to like grow and edit and expand the world, you know? I felt kind of like meh about the book, but I gave the first book like 3.5 stars, and this book wasn't as good, so that's why I gave it 2.5. Alright, and then my last category for the video is actually books that I've read in vlogs, or I'm reading in vlogs that have to come out in the future. So it'll be really, really fast. I just wanted to briefly mention, first off, I read The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, which I had a whole reading vlog that I posted. This book took a lot out of me. My reading slump kind of started once I finished this, because how do you go from reading an 800-page Russian classic into just like reading regular books again? It kind of like, it messed with my head. Like, it didn't work out perfectly. This is the first book I think I've ever on Goodreads decided not to rate. Like, I haven't rated this because I don't really know how to rate it. Like, I could just rate it 5 stars because it's a really impactful book, you know? Like, it made a huge impact on me. But at the same time, I don't know if it belongs in my 5-star books. So I decided not to rate it. It kind of stands on its own, that it is what it is. It's an incredible book about a time period in Russia in the 1800s, and focusing around 3 brothers who are each impacted by their father's mistreatment or disregard for them in different ways, and then all come back together after being like separated as children, come back together as adults and reconnect with one another. And then the father is killed, and then they have to solve what happened to him, but also just reckon with themselves about death and a lot of religion. God, a lot of religion. That's probably the reason why I don't want to give it 5 stars too, because I'm just like, there's so much religion. I did think it was really, really impactful, and I love Ivan Karamazov with my whole heart and soul. I still search up fan art when I'm like sad and I'm like, oh, I want to see Ivan's face, then I search up fan art online. I loved his character so much, so this book was 100% worth reading just so I can get into Ivan Karamazov's head for a little while. I'm just devastated we never got the sequels. I deserved another 800 pages with these characters. They needed more time. We were left so unresolved, even though so many things happened. But yeah, if you're looking for a classic to read to get into classics, don't start with this one. I really would not. But I feel like I've been getting back into it recently, and I wanted a challenge, and it was a challenge that I enjoyed. But yeah, I'll leave it there, and you can watch the video if you want more details. And then the other book I finished this month that I don't want to talk about a ton because I haven't posted a video about it yet, but I did read The Sword of Kagan by M.L. Wang. I was supposed to have posted that video already with a couple of other fantasy books I was reading, but like I said, reading slump, delays, this is a hobby, you know, stuff gets in the way, so it's fine. But I'll just briefly mention that I did finish The Sword of Kagan this month. I really, really loved it. I gave it 4.5 stars. I love the world, I love the characters so much, and therefore the only thing that really took off that 0.5 star is just that it was so clearly written as part of this world that she was writing and like foreshadowing the stuff that she was writing in her other series, which has now been discontinued. And I was reading her author's note about why it was discontinued, and I totally get it. She wrote the original books when she was a child, and she now feels like the world itself would need a massive overhaul in order to make sense. So fair, totally understandable. It just makes this book like a little bit like I could have used more, you know? It's also just a weird book for pacing, honestly. I had a lot of problems. But it overcomes those problems by sheer like skill of character and skill of world building and magic system, and oh, it was just really, really good, and you'll see more about that in that vlog whenever it gets posted. Those were all 16 books I read this month. This video is probably a lot longer than I'd planned it to be because I can already see how long the clips are, and I didn't mean to talk for this long. I read a lot of really amazing books this month, and I really had a good time reading, especially in the beginning of the month. It was a huge comfort to me, and if reading is a comfort to you too, please share what books you are reading that are comforting you in these trying times. If you read any of these books, let me know. If you are going to or thinking about reading any of these books, definitely let me know. And I guess I'll just leave it there. If you want to leave a comment, a like, a subscribe, whatever you're gonna do, please feel free, always. And thank you so, so much for making it this far with this channel and with this video. And I will see you in the next one. Bye!